Lindsay, you are from Wales. You were born in Wales and you still live in Wales, but you went away to university and studied history. Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about studying history and how that has continued to shape your thinking and your perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I studied modern European history in Oxford, where I did a master's degree for a few years. And I realized when I was a student that all my tutors were Marxists. So they had a particular interpretation of history. They even saw the Reformation and the Methodist movement as a social movement, not related to anything gospel-oriented at all. And I began to realize the importance of worldview while I was a student, and that if I wanted to have a look at history through the lens of being a Christian, I actually had to work much harder and do more reading and more research in order to respond to some of the challenges that they brought. So, for example, I was doing some research on the Methodists and John Wesley, which they interpreted as a working class movement. And so I had to read Wesley's writings. He actually went to the same college I went to, but he was there 200 years earlier. And in order to respond to my tutors, who were convinced Marxists, at least until the early 90s, when they went through a huge shock with the changes in Eastern Europe, I had to read around the material much more. And actually, to begin to have develop a Christian mind, by which I mean applying biblical truth to every sphere of life, including the academic discipline, that was like a second conversion. Because I came from a church background which was very pietistic, very strong emphasis on godliness, but totally cut off from the world. So, for example, it was a church made up of many people in low-paid jobs, 300 people. I was the first person to go to university from this church in a coal mining town. And there was a kind of fear of the wider world, actually. So God did a remarkable work in our church in a few years. The youth group grew from, I think, 15 to 250 young people in a year. But the leaders panicked because they thought, what do we do with all these young people and protect them from being corrupted? So one of the leaders came up with a bright idea. Let's arrange a meeting every night of the week and tell them that they have to come to all of them. Prayer meeting, youth meeting, and so on. They lost lots of them. Because what they didn't do is help us to critique films, to respond to the challenges our friends shared with us, and to be equipped to respond to the world and engage in living in it. So that also therefore affected. The night before I went to university, I was studying history and political theory, and one of the deacons, who was a refuse collector, came up to me and said, "What are you studying?" I said, "History and philosophy." He said, "Brother, just remember what the Bible says about vain philosophy." It panicked me the day before I went to university, because there weren't people in the church who saw that it was possible to have bring the scriptures to bear on every sphere of life. When you realize that, it's so liberating when you see that the Lordship of Christ touches on every area of life. When it comes to study of history, some of the key things I observed is there are great stories from the history of the church about people who have gone on before us, from which we can learn. The New Testament calls them a cloud of witnesses. And actually, there's almost nothing that we experience in the contemporary world that believers have not experienced in the past. A few years ago, I was asked, when it was the anniversary of the Reformation in Europe in 2017, I was asked to give a lecture here on lessons we've learned from the Reformation. I think the book is here. The book was published subsequently. So I did some research then on Calvin and Luther's contribution. And there's much that we can learn from their example. So we learn from past failings and successes of believers. For example, you look at some of the judges in the Old Testament, and there's a verse there that says, where the judges are told to drive the evildoers out of the land. And one of the lessons in Christian leadership is that sometimes if you have a very difficult, disruptive person, you have to move them on. Otherwise, they create a kind of cancer in the movement and organization. So lessons from the past is important. Understanding our theological and biblical roots is also very important because it gives us a sense of identity. As John Lennox said to me a few years ago here, if you don't understand where you came from, you won't understand who you are, and you definitely won't know where to go to. And you'll be condemned to repeating the mistakes of the past. So be a student of church history as well as your own cultural history. Understanding the past also helps us to shape the vision for the present and the future. So the study of history is not just looking at the past, but it gives us principles, ideas, examples, a framework for the future. So I would say every Christian needs to be a historian.
Amen.
Otherwise we become very, very shallow indeed. And it's very important to learn from some of these. We had a history lecture the other night. There should be one every year in this gathering. So it's good to evaluate our current context, but it's really important to learn lessons from history because they help to shape the present and shape our vision.
Totally. My leadership is constantly being shaped by reading of church history. It's so powerful to hear you say that. Come on, you talked about vision specifically there. We'll come on to some of the other details, but one of the sort of key things that many people have known you for is your work as the IFE's Gen Sec. How many years were you in that role for?
16.
16 years, and you were how old when you took that role?
37.
And
I was European Director at 27, very young.
So steep learning curve that you went through in that role. Yeah. One of the things you mentioned when we spoke last night was the importance of vision in that kind of leadership role. Yeah. Just talk a little bit more about how vision was shaped, what part you played in that, how it changed, and also perhaps how you sustained the sort of clarity and focus on that vision in your leadership role.
Well, first of all, it's kind of difficult to get a definition of vision, but John Stott gave me the best I've heard. He said, vision is a picture of the future which produces passion. So a sense of where you're going in the future, which gives, and you can tell it with some leaders, they're passionate about where they're headed and what they're investing in. And so one of the things to search for is God's help to discern what should I invest my time and energy in. You can't change, there can be changes in ministry over the years, but I often say to folks, you can't really build a significant work in 3 years. Ask God to give you a task to which you give at least a decade of your life. As someone said, we overestimate what we can accomplish in 3 years, and we underestimate what we can accomplish in 10 years. In IFES, there are movements in now over 160 countries. I almost know none, where there hasn't been someone who was given 10 years. And those that I don't see growing, they have staccato existence. They change leadership every 3 or 4 years. You just can't build the foundations in that context. So it is sometimes appropriate to change. The second thing is I learned a beautiful lesson from Ramez Attallah, who is one of the most outstanding leaders in the world at the moment. He once said his observation on leaders was that the best leaders are task-orientated, not gift-orientated. I get so frustrated when American young people come to Europe and at 25 years of age say to me, I can't do that because somebody's told me I'm an ABC in terms of my gifting. If 60% of what you spend your time in is related primarily to your gift, that's pretty good. There are some things you have to do as a leader which are not necessarily your primary gifts. They just have to be done because it's part of leadership. So let me give you 2 examples. The reason I engage in fundraising is because it put clothes on the backs of children and food on the table of the family. And it's a pastoral dimension. So I don't despise having to ask friends to support a ministry financially, because a concern to raise that money issues out of a concern for the people I'm seeking to lead. That's why I do fundraising and fund development. It's not dirty work. It's caring for God's people in my care. Secondly, correspondence. One of the failures of many young leaders is they don't follow through in correspondence. I make a note of every conversation I have with people, and if I promise something, I write it in this little book, and I write to them within 2 weeks of meeting them. It's very important to follow through on promises from conversations. And I watched John Stott do this. He used to write handwritten letters to people who were young leaders afterwards. He wrote one to me when I was General Secretary, 2 sides of a page. I've still got it. Like gold dust. It's very meaningful. You may feel you like to receive letters from older leaders, but there are also people under you, younger students and others. If you send them a personalized note, it means a lot. So I got in the habit of I carry with me about 50 postcards. And George Vaux once said to me, never get caught without some postcards to write or books to read if you're on a bus or a train or a plane that's delayed, and then you don't get so frustrated. So I get out the postcards and write them to people just as an expression of interest. And as I traveled around the world, I saw many of these postcards on toilet walls, on kitchen walls in houses. And many people said, thank you for the postcard. I couldn't understand any of your handwriting because you write like a doctor, but we were grateful for the card. And their kids liked them too. So that's one connection to raising funds, keeping promises about correspondence, writing to people, showing an interest. Even George Vaux was fantastic in this way. He'd phone 3 or 4 people every day, even when they weren't phoning him. Let me tell you one lesson I learned from traveling with him. He had a little book like this, and every year he added the name of another leader or two. He had 350 names in this book. Every year he wrote to one of them a personal letter, even if they didn't write back. So if you were in this list of leaders that he met through the years he was traveling, you got a book at least once in the year and a little note, a letter, and he would remember if you didn't through the year. And I thought, what a fantastic example of taking an interest in people and also writing down names and memorizing them.
So this is one of the top things that when we were chatting yesterday, people said, like, how does Lindsay know so many people? He must just be very, very gifted in remembering names. But I discovered last night it's not. So you are very good at remembering names, but it's much more than that. It's a system. It's a real intentionality. Take us, I'd love.
Well, first of all, God did give me a very good memory and recall. But I think remembering names and the way names are spelled and pronounced is very important. So I always take time to get the pronunciation of a person's name, especially if it's a complicated one like a Polish name, to say it correctly. It's partly because my name is unusual. And even in my own family, it was spelled 5 different ways because my aunties and uncles couldn't get to grips with it. And I realized that people like to have their names said properly and written properly in emails or letters. When I started traveling with IFS was working in 100 countries in 91. It was 160 countries, I think, in about 15 years later, because of the fall of the Berlin Wall opened up the advance of the gospel in so many countries. So I started a little file or a diary, and I decided, well, if there are 150 countries, I would like to know at least 3 to 5 names of leading believers in every one of the countries. And I'll pray for 5 countries a day through the month. That's how I memorized the names. So 5 countries a day, 3 people. It didn't take more than 15 minutes. But if you're praying for people and their families once a month, that's how you remember the names. It's embedded in your brain. So I'm not able to keep that up now, but that's how all the countries that we were involved in. It wasn't all 200 countries in the world, but I had 3 to 5 names for each one. Not all of them were IFAS people. They were just believers who were leaders I came across in those countries. And that relates to another thing about leadership. In my view, the best leaders don't talk obsessively about their own ministry. It's really boring to just hear somebody drone on for half an hour about what they're doing. The special leaders are those, and you can see them straight away, they spend 15 minutes talking about what God is doing through other people. And they say, have you heard about what God's doing through him or her? And they've got nothing to do with them in terms of ministry. And what that shows is they're more interested in the advance of the gospel than their own organization. Even George Verwer, who was one of my great influences, I think, he said to me towards the end of his life, I am more interested in the advance of the gospel around the world than I am in OM, which I created under God 60 years ago. Those are rare people. They're the leaders you want to spend time with. And sometimes you can be with those people, and after 15 minutes, you have to say to them, sorry, we've been talking 15 minutes. You're telling me what other people are doing. Could you just remind me what your ministry is? I've forgotten. Maybe I missed it when you said something. Those people are really special. When you're young, don't get pushed into a silo where all you're talking about is your own ministry. It's a real turn-off. And it's not the way God wants us to be. He doesn't want us to be in silos. He wants us to be focused on the advance of the gospel, whoever is leading, in our own country and elsewhere. It's really small-minded to be just obsessively focused on my own ministry. And I don't think God blesses that. I think he loves to see people whose whole orientation is the gospel. An example, when meeting with people who need financial assistance, introducing them to donors rather than ourselves. I tell you what, when you do that, the donors want to support you as well, because they think this person is really interested in the wider cause of the gospel.
Yeah. And Lindsay, these are not just personal practices for you. I know from things you've said that you've been really intentional about building some of these things into the culture of the teams you've led. Do you want to say anything more about that? So it's not just, this is my leadership style, but you've fostered a culture.
Well, I have to say, team leadership is something I've had to work on over the years. You may not all be familiar with the game of rugby, which is a national Welsh sport, which we don't speak about these days. But
great game.
You can tell with some people when they're playing rugby, they're always looking for the gap to go through. That's the way I played rugby, and that was my early leadership style. But I realized that if you want things to go forward, you have to build a team. And you have to build a team of composite gifts. So the reason people love the game of rugby is there's room in the team for short guys who can't run very far but have broad shoulders, and for others who are very lean and quick. And there's a role for each of them in the team. My early style of working was not that, I'm afraid. I was much more of a fast-moving, there's the direction, I'm going there. And then once I turned around, there was nobody behind me, because I hadn't taken enough time to consult with people and take them with me. And I learned, actually through painful experience, that going a little bit slower and getting people to be on the same page, process became important. I mentioned how people are important. I mentioned how now process is important. That's the second P. Keeping your promises, that's the third one. If you promise to do something, do it. Write it down straight away so you just don't rely on the memory, but keep promises. And my wife gave me one verse from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, which says, the honorable man keeps his promise even to his own hurt. So be slow to make promises, but if you make them, just keep them. And people really value that in leaders. But related to teams, I think sometimes I move too fast with inadequate consultation. And I noticed observing some agencies asking, how have they lasted so long? I'll give you one example of the best. It used to be called China Inland Mission, or OMF. And the leadership there is very consultative. So they move slowly to make decisions, but they get people on board. And in that way, because they have a clear system of values and convictions, they've kept in the right direction for 150 years. And you see some ministries that go off like a rocket and grow so fast. When the leader gets exhausted or goes off the page, they collapse. Why? Because he or she has not gathered like-minded people around them who share the vision with them, who may not be as dynamic, may not be as fast-moving, but together they corporately maintain and hold the vision which the dynamic leader has been able to share with them. Most new ministries have a dynamic leader to start with. It's very difficult to continue on by finding a similar dynamic leader. That happened historically in the Reformation. Luther didn't have a successor, and Calvin definitely didn't have one. They were all fighting after he left. You watch that happen in some Christian organizations, fighting over the legacy. He died young, 55. But some people asked me when I was studying history of the Reformation and Calvin, the church grew quickly in France when he was alive. Why did it fall apart afterwards? Partly was persecution, but partly the leaders behind him just fought each other. They couldn't agree on the direction. And they fought over secondary issues. You have to decide what is worth fighting on, and there's very little. It's the core of the gospel. Most other things are personalized. For example, do we need to fight over the role of women in leadership? Sorry, it's secondary. And if you look at the ministry of Jesus, I've never heard a sermon on Luke 8, verses 1 to 3, where it says there were many women following Jesus in addition to the disciples. They named the women. They even supported the disciples out of their own resources. I never hear a man speaking on that. Because it's inconvenient. It's inconvenient for men who want to shut women out. And in relation to this, the big question we should ask is not what are the limits on women, but rather how on earth are we going to get the women to do half of what God's calling them to do in the first place? Because we need everybody on board. So we need to be very careful. That's not to say we shouldn't be interested in these things or concerned about them or to understand what the scripture says. But we just need to discern what's primary and what's secondary in terms of the advance of the gospel. And that relates to team ministry. So I sometimes failed when it came to building a team. And thank you, I set out a vision sometimes. And the turning point for me was when one Chinese guy said to me when I was leading in IFS, your vision is very clear, but it's your vision. It's not ours. If you want it to be ours, you've got to slow down.
I think one of two of us in this room might relate to that, because there's a lot of entrepreneurs sitting around here.
Take time to talk with us and dialogue. And then one African brother said to me here 3 years ago, I'm very glad to be invited to this gathering, Lindsay. I'm glad to be at the table. But I want to speak at the table. I don't just want to sit and listen to you brothers from the north. I think God has given me something to say. Please allow me the freedom to make a contribution. And then I was in another meeting, a Lausanne meeting, before the Cape Town Congress in 2015. We had a meeting in Oxford, and there were some leaders there from around the world gathering. And one of the American leaders said, why don't the Latin Americans speak up? And the Westerners who only spoke English were speaking quickly. And then a Latin American guy said, we will speak up if you stop and give us time to do so. And we believe we have something to share. So it's very important to build connectedness and a team in our own culture. But if God gives you an open door to be engaged in building a team beyond your own culture, you must learn, or we must learn, to engage with other voices and give them the time to speak. And some of them will be much slower and more hesitant and reticent. I was in a meeting recently and there was an African brother there. He's a very insightful guy. He didn't say anything for 3 hours. Then somebody asked him, what do you think? He said something, it was like gold dust.
Changed a moment.
Oh yeah, and then somebody said to him, maybe you should lead this discussion because you're wiser than the rest of us. So sometimes the quiet people may have something significant to say, but they have to be drawn out. And part of the role of the leader is to create space for them to contribute. If you're just developing a monocultural ministry, you're actually cheating yourself because there are so many good things now that God is giving to the global church through our brothers and sisters who come from other cultures, but they may have a mild inferiority complex and feel, what can I say? I don't have any money, for example. That's the classic case. But sometimes there's so much wisdom embedded there. I remember talking with the Chinese leaders in the meeting in Oxford before Cape Town. We went round the room and we divided the world into 12 regions. And we wanted each region to have one slot in the Congress to share something with the wider world. And I said to the Chinese leaders, brothers, if you have one evening, what would you like to share? We would like to share how to survive in the midst of persecution, because we think we have a lot of experience in that. It was like an atomic bomb dropping in the room. So work hard to build a team where each person contributes. And if you do so, you don't lose authority. People will trust you and value you, and they will follow more readily. And if you do something that they are not totally convinced of, you're much more likely to get their support and for them to believe the best of you and give you space than if you'd never asked them in the first place.
If they feel heard, they're going to cope better with things that is
because people don't get everything they want.
Yeah. You've touched on that as being a kind of lesson learned and perhaps some mistakes along the way. What are some of the other sort of key failures or disappointments that you look back on and go, oh, that was just a vital thing I needed to learn?
Two things. First, don't put the ministry ahead of your family. I've seen so many families wrecked, especially with the men, who are just obsessed by a vision that they sense God has given them, which He may have given them, and they just neglect their wives and kids. It's very painful. And eventually you leave the ministry and you've still got the family. And you've got to live with them. And they may have to care for you.
Or you haven't, and that would be very painful. Yeah.
And I've seen cases of that. And sometimes guys say to me, what helps you to survive long term? And I say to them two things. The grace of God, which is the fountain from which all joy flows and helps you to deal with disappointment. And gentlemen, marry a good woman that you can't run over, but who'll stand up to you and challenge you and give some suggestions. Let me illustrate. My wife is much shorter than me and smaller than me, but the depth of her conviction is deeper. And before I married her, somebody said to me, you need a woman you can't run over who will stand up to you. You should think of marrying her. So I did. Best piece of advice.
That's the kind of friend we all need.
Yeah. And then she is very, very supportive. But when we started the work with IFES, which involved 3 months of traveling around the world, actually for 35 years, that's unnatural, away from the family. So you need a pretty outstanding spouse in that case. And she said to me, if we're going to survive, we need some ground rules. Let me suggest some to you. Not rules you've got to keep all the time, but if you don't know what they are, you can occasionally break them. If you don't know what they are, you'll just carry on as you are. Rule number 1, please don't accept an invitation over the phone. Because your instinct is to say yes, especially to all your friends. And you've got too many friends. You can't do everything. Limit the number of meetings you'll speak in during the year. Focus was on the student ministry, so she said, don't be an elder or a deacon in the church as well. You can't fight a battle on all fronts. And the churches have always released me to do the ministry beyond the church as a consequence, seeing that it was their contribution to the wider world. Third, please don't be away on consecutive Sundays. If you have a family, you need to be in church with your son. And we lost our only daughter. She died when she was small, which was the biggest tragedy in our family. And it meant, therefore, that family relationships It's very painful if you lose a child. The scars remain for the rest of your life. I have a rugby scar here. It's not painful anymore, but the scar's still there. These things leave scars, and so it makes you more sensitive to family context. Especially if you're a guy. If you have sons, you need to be in church with those boys. And you need to be around to talk with your daughter and dialogue with them and so on. Those early years go so quickly. And some guys said to me, when I asked them what their calling is, they only talk about their ministry. Gentlemen, caring for your family is your calling. If you fail on that, you're out. You just get lost.
Every single one of us. I know some of the women in the room are really wrestling with that in different ways. It's so important for us to hear that and be reminded of it.
What that means is sometimes you have to pull back for a period of time. And women are often better at this than the men are, actually. That they will sacrificially decide, I can't do everything I would like to do at the moment because my family's at a particular stage. Maybe if I can pull back for a few years, and then I'll be able to invest later, which is what my wife did. My wife was a gifted worker, but she said to me, we can't be both involved in public traveling and teaching ministries. She'll come with me on some visits, but I need to build a nest. And she got a teaching job. She was a very good teacher and did that for 15 years until my son was 16. And then we started traveling together when he went to university.
They still need you after 16, but they need you in a different way, don't they?
They're coming home and so on. So it's a question of timing. In our case, when our daughter died, before then, our family rule was you can't travel more than 13 weeks a year of nights. That's 25%. When our daughter died, cut right back to 6 weeks for 3 years because we needed time to grieve and work through the process. And it's not appropriate to pile the pressure on the other members of the family. And traveling can be an escape from those situations if you're not careful. So those were some of the rules. There were others which were particular to our situation. But she knew my personality, which is focused on serving others and responding to friends. And you can't do everything. You just have to choose where you invest. The other thing was I joined no boards of any other agency for 30 years. But since I stepped down as General Secretary of IFS, now I'm on 5 supporting other missionaries in a different role because I don't have any formal leadership role now.
And what a blessing to bring all that experience of being the executive leader, if you like, into the governance. And you have mentioned something of a journey you've been on in your own kind of mindset towards governance when you stepped into that role of Gen Sec of IFES and how you started to think about the role of the board and the relationship with the board. Let's land on that for a little while because that's so valuable.
Well, the role of a board, which is a term I never heard as a young man, is the governance of the ministry. And I just thought until I was in my mid-30s, they were just a bunch of old guys who got in the way. That I wanted to move faster. Why did I have to prepare papers for all these guys to discuss for 3 or 4 days? And then when I became General Secretary of IFS at 37, we had a board which was made up of 12 people from each region of the world, only 1 European, 1 North American, 2 Africans, 1 Middle Eastern, and so on. And I just found they had corporate wisdom. And they saved me many times by giving wise advice on difficult issues that I didn't know how to deal with. They also gave very good advice on financial matters. They were able to scrutinize the financial details more than I would. I didn't have that background. So we had 2 or 3 people who were good financially. There were some women on the board who were very astute pastorally, who helped me in terms of the care and the ministry amongst the women. And they reviewed me every year. I had a significant review every year. Every 2 years, they wrote to between 30 and 50 people I'd met in the previous 2 years and asked them a series of questions. Church leaders, leaders in other countries, female staff workers, male staff workers, leaders of other mission agencies I had connections with.
And some of those will have been people you've upset along the way, either necessarily or unhelpfully, but and they get to speak into your annual review.
Well, they drew up conclusions then, and then the chairman, who was very good, would take me aside and say, Lindsay, we're very pleased. Let me tell you 5 things that we're grateful for. Then after about an hour, he'd say, just 1 or 2 things you might want to be careful of that we've picked up. And you'd watch the following year to see if it had deteriorated. Then if a crisis was going to occur, you weren't surprised by it because you saw the signals appearing. And the problem for some people, this is a problem especially for guys, they appoint board members who are friends. And the primary role of the board members is the fruitfulness of the ministry. They will want to be friends with the leader, but if the friendship comes first, you can end up just defending the leader in doing the indefensible or something which is wrong. And that's why, and I see that happening with quite a number of boards I can see at the moment, even in senior ministries where the leader has just controlled the appointment of board members. It's best to have a subcommittee of the board who looks at the criteria for selection of board members, male, female, different nationalities, some people who can handle finance, others who are good with policy or field-related matters. So you're getting voices giving good advice about all of these things.
And you mentioned that you were kind of looking years ahead in terms of thinking about the future needs of the ministry and what that meant for the makeup of the board, and therefore who you might be starting to draw into conversations about governance.
Well, first of all, we brought in rules because we found that when we had a board of 15 people from around the world, nobody ever wanted to leave. They wanted to stay until they died. And that's disastrous because you get rigor mortis then and defensiveness. Nobody wanted to leave, so we had to institute the rule, you serve for 8 years and half the board goes off after 4 years. So you have 7 or 8 fresh people after 4 years. And so there's some change and some continuity. You have to have a search committee which looks for people. And personally, as I traveled around, I began to realize that governance was crucial because they would select my successor, whoever that was. So I started looking for board members about 8 years before they were appointed because it's so difficult to find good ones, especially after some of the early ones we had were not good choices. And we had to move those folks off after a few years because they didn't have the appropriate gifting and orientation. It sounds really boring to young guys especially to have a board of governance. And often what a lot of men do is they move towards having, let's just have an advisory committee. People who give us advice, no good. It's got to be governance and recognize that we are all fallen.
Yeah, a board that has real teeth, who can really kind of take you to task if the issues are significant.
Otherwise, these things, if they're unchecked, I've seen in several agencies we both are aware of in recent years where the senior leader executive just had too much control. And it's not good for any of us, actually, because we're flawed human beings and we have blind spots. And it's good first to acknowledge that and recognize that we need others. The other thing is in terms of appointment of people around you, my orientation primarily was people and field. But I wasn't very good at structures and organizational development. And then we had to bring in a lady from Hong Kong who was just brilliant in helping us to shape the organization, for which I had no background. And then I appointed an assistant who was actually Kenyan. He saved me many times. He was just brilliant at organizational development. So if there was a structural thing, he'd say, leave it to me. And he'd work at shaping the structure, and I'd look at it and think, if I was asked to do this on my own, it would be chaos. But that's why you need to have people around you who have composite gifts which add to yours, and trust them. I had 3 people like that, second in command, as it were. Those people are like gold dust. People who they don't want to run the outfit. Yep. They just want it to work well. And they want to help you avoid failure. Try and find people like that.
Some people in this room may actually be that person, sort of working alongside perhaps the initiating, innovative leader, trying to help build the organisation. What have you particularly valued about the role, the contribution of people in that role?
Well, I would have been out within a few years without them. They were exceptional. Yeah. They made me look much better than I was.
Well, that's good.
That is reality. And actually, the one guy I had as an assistant, I'd say, look, I'd be happy if you were General Secretary and I was in the other role, except that the structure would probably collapse because my gifts weren't oriented that way. If you have such people, you have to trust them. You have to spend time with them. You have to let them in on your thinking. You have to give them the freedom to say, I don't think that's a good move, So meet with them to eat, travel, share your innermost convictions about the future. We need a sounding board. You need your spouse to be in on that, but the spouse will be structurally outside
a different perspective,
of the decision
which
making.
Is valuable in itself. Yeah.
I mean, this may be a sexist comment, but the reality is for the guys, I'm amazed at my wife's insight into how other people tick. She sees things I never saw.
In our house, it's my husband who has that.
Yeah. But, sometimes she'd say, what do you think of so-and-so if we were talking with them over dinner? I'd say, well, what you saw. She said, can't you look beyond the superficial? Didn't you see the signals, for example? Now, sometimes there are guys who have that intuitive sense, but having people around you who can see things you can't see is a great gift, because we don't have 360-degree vision on our own, I'm afraid. So I think the appointment of the team around you is really critical. If you're in that position, when I first started as General Secretary, I had a very wise advisor who was 25 years older than me. He was a Presbyterian minister who didn't like preaching. He just liked making things work. And somebody complained straight away when I started, he's different to the previous General Secretary. He's moving so fast, not consulting enough. Can you do something to sort him out? And he said this to them. Listen, this is how we work. You have to learn how to manage him, not him learn how to manage you. And only a good second in command, as it were, could see that sometimes people can be complaining rather than help to think, how can I learn to work with this person so that we can corporately function well
and to
together?
have the boldness and courage to speak into those situations, which is a gift for people in that role. And if you're in that role, or perhaps if you have someone in that role related to you, give them the mandate. I think that can be so valuable.
And if you're in that position, it's a pivotal position.
Yeah.
It's the kind of Jethro to Moses.
Yeah. What a gift.
You need people around you. Yeah.
Lindsay, some of the other sort of factors of being on the road, presumably you just have a real tangible sense of spiritual warfare going on some of the time. Tell us a little bit about that, and also in what ways have you helped to sort of guard against spiritual dryness and getting separated from your local church family you've touched on already, and so on. Let's just land in that space for a bit.
I think spiritual dryness, apart from personal devotions, which is different for everybody, some people lock into using some materials, others need variety, especially the more creative types. They get bored if they're just using one system all the time. And so be open to a variety of helps or aids which help you with your Bible study and reflection. Secondly, gather around you or get a group of people who are committed to praying for you as you travel. In the church that we were in for a long time, when we lived in another city, there were a group of people who prayed every Monday morning at 7 o'clock before work for those who were missionaries sent out from the church. I have to say it was mostly women. Some of them were consultant doctors. And
getting up at 7 a.m. to pray.
yeah, before they went to work, they were like gold dust, and you could almost sense when you were in some difficult situations, and sometimes I was in very dangerous situations, and I was just thankful for the intercessory prayers of God's people, and that made a huge difference. I could talk about some of those dangerous situations in another context, but that prayer group behind the scenes was very important. Then, when I was 21 as a student, in Oxford in those days, we'd have a lot of famous speakers come and speak. Martin Lloyd-Jones, John Stott, J.I. Packer, N.T. Wright. They all came to speak, and that's when I met them for the first time, coming to speak. And I remember having a long conversation with Lloyd-Jones, who was a great preacher, probably the greatest preacher I'd heard, when I was 21, 22. And I said to him, any tips for a young person starting out in Christian ministry? And the only piece of advice he gave was, keep up your reading. He said, you can tell, especially with young preachers, if they're reading or not, because they're repeating their sermons and their illustrations. Or they've done formal theological training and they think that's enough. He said, read widely, read commentaries and things that stretch your thinking, and read inspirational biographies, but keep reading. And he said this was a lifelong discipline for him. And he said, I'm not a speed reader. The fastest I can ever read, he said, is 20 pages an hour, but I try to capture the essence of the argument. And that was very, very helpful. And the other two people that helped me in that respect were George Verwer, first of all, who founded OM, who in my view is the greatest missionary leader in the world of the last 60 years. Very, very generous spirit, always speaking about other ministries and commending them. He took me in the back of a Volkswagen van for several weeks through the Middle East when I was about 26. And I noticed he was reading all the time articles. And a voracious reader, didn't have great formal education before, but he read a lot of articles. And so I thought, I'll do that as well. And if I read an article or a newspaper with a good piece in it, I tear out the page, put it in my filing system, and I have maybe 25 filing cabinets of articles from the last 50 years.
Do you mark them up as you write?
On every subject under the sun. Abortion, administration, genetic engineering, whatever it is, town planning. So as I'm traveling, if I come across people and I ask them, what's your work or your ministry? If I meet somebody who's an architect, I say to them, can I send you some good articles I've read on a Christian approach to architecture or town planning or whatever it is. So this is hard copy resources for me that I send to people around the world that I've accumulated over 50 years because of that, observing what Verwer did. And I saw the same thing with Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was probably the best answerer of questions I've ever come across. And I remember my wife spent a year in Le Brie with Schaeffer in Switzerland. I remember going there on one occasion before we were married, and Schaeffer used to come into the room and he'd just sit down on a Saturday evening with a group like this, and he'd say, right, what's the first question? No sermon. And people would throw questions at him like hand grenades. He was a very passionate person, but very cool in answering questions. So they're very angry young people. Throwing questions, he'd just go, catch. And then he'd take time to answer the question. And some of the questions were stupid. And people in the group would laugh. He never laughed. He treated everybody with dignity, even if it was an idiotic question. And when he'd answer the question, then he'd say, have I answered your question? Give them a second chance. And then if you're not satisfied, can we talk afterwards? What I learned from that was he just treated everybody with dignity, made in the image of God. And then beyond that, he would be quoting from films or the theatre or books. And somebody said to him, how is it you're quoting from all these books and these films and so on? How can you possibly find the time to get to them all? He said, I don't. I read the reviews every week, 8 pages every weekend on what's new in the theatre, what are the new films, what are the influential books. And he said, if there's something really important that I need to understand in contemporary culture, I may then read it or watch it if it's useful. And I thought, I'm going to do that. So I read those 8 pages every Saturday. And they're the best evangelistic quotes I get every week. I don't go to many films at all, but I read what are the hot films that people are watching, and I read what's in the theatre. And I read it as usually it's 8 pages in the culture magazine of the Times or the Telegraph, and it's a very quick summary of what are people reading these days, what are the films which are influential, which is very important for reaching non-believers, and what's in the theatre in order to keep in touch culturally. So that was there with Verwer, with Schaeffer. John Stott was the same, who used to say that you have to look 2 ways. You have to look at Scripture, you have to look at the culture in order to engage. So in terms of being stimulated to maintain a connection with or an engagement with the culture, and also if you're traveling, it's a great way to use the time to read these articles.
Yeah, and articles being a bit shorter, it's just easier to kind of concentrate.
Well, people get to the core of the argument within 1 page.
Yeah.
I just did a seminar here 2 days ago on the Reformers and art, their view of art. And I pulled out an article I read in 1976 on Calvin and the arts from my filing. It was fantastic. Somebody had done all the research for me. So it's very, very useful. So read widely and access material, not just thinking of yourself, but the people you could be called on to help in your ministry, and a wide range of people who may be very different to you. I have a whole series of articles on genetic engineering or abortion. I'm not a medic, but I gathered these because I saw some of the students I was working with were struggling with the ethical issues here, and I thought, if I don't understand the arguments, I better have the arguments written by somebody else who knows what they're talking about, so I can at least help them by giving them an article.
Lindsay, you've mentioned a lot of people, well, a few key people who've had a big influence on you: George Verwer, Lloyd Jones. Who are some of the best leaders that you've worked with, and just some of your reflections on their leadership?
Well, one of them was the person who was General Secretary of IPS before me, and he was Chinese. Chua Weihan, his name was. And he was the best talent spotter of young leaders I've ever come across. And he appointed about 6 of us under 35 years of age for regional roles. I was 27. Almost nobody in Europe knew who I was, and some people thought this guy is just interested in evangelism. He knows nothing about anything else. But he obviously spotted something, and he gave us a chance. He appointed Ramez Atala in the Middle East, for example. He appointed Dieter Breppel in Latin America. He brought in Samuel Escobar, some significant leaders around the world. He was a great talent spotter, and he wasn't afraid of appointing people he thought were more gifted than he was. Very much at ease with himself. And he gave these younger guys opportunity. And what he did, therefore, was he shaped the culture of the ministry for 30 years after he left, because they all succeeded him. And they imbibed the vision that he had established. He was the most gifted talent spotter that I'd come across.
That's an extraordinary statement. I mean, let's just pause on that for a moment. So by the talent he spotted and the way he appointed and presumably trained and supported people into those roles, he shaped the ministry for 30 years after he left. I mean, in fact, that is true in the sense that that is what happens. The appointments each of us make will shape those ministries for many years to come. But it's the intentionality of it and the excellence that he was able to bring to the ministry and leave when he left.
Yeah.
So it reframes our thinking about recruitment, doesn't it?
Well, I served in the role he had for 16 years, and my successor did 12 years. That's 28 years. And he was involved. He appointed both of us under 30 years of age. And I would say for many of us in leadership, we need to start thinking about succession from the time we start. Looking around for succession and board members and co-workers, it drives me to despair when guys just talk about their own ministry and are obsessive about my ministry and my vision. That's not the way to function. We have to be thinking of how can we, with others, build the work of God and advance the cause of the gospel for as long as possible by laying down foundations and investing others who can take things further than we can. So that if God spares us to live longer, we can look back and rejoice that we're a part of introducing these people to the ministry, and they're now doing better than we are.
And frankly, there's not going to be a shortage of other things that we can go on to do, so there should be no hesitation about handing it on when people are ready to take it on.
And if you do that, they'll invite you back. Yeah. That's another thing. I despair of people. I remember talking with one African brother and saying, what do you do when old leaders move out of the way and new ones come in? He said, we kill the old leaders. That's unbiblical. That's unbiblical. And I've seen in some agencies, when there has been a older leader, people just cut them off when they come in because they feel threatened by their predecessor. Now, they don't need to have an executive role anymore, but you can draw on their wisdom. This is where the Jewish tradition and the Old Testament, and frankly in Asia as well, particularly to some extent in Africa, is better than Europe. There is an advantage in people no longer having institutional authority. So when I finished as General Secretary of IFS, I'm not on any committees at all. But the General Secretary said, you're free to take up invitations as people invite them, and I'll pay for your travel because I trust you, and just make sure what you're saying is in line with our current vision and so on. And instead, he came in as a junior office worker when I was General Secretary. It's a long time ago. So there should be a role for people who move on from institutional leadership, but it may have to be like a kind of uncle or auntie. Let me give one example, okay? With Samuel Escobar from Latin America. In 2015, when I was involved with the Lausanne movement, we had Lausanne 3 in Cape Town. And on one evening, there was a presentation on the advance of the gospel in Latin America. And the person organizing the evening had slipped in this video on Latin America, which was a very poor video, which didn't show Latin American leaders in good light. Those of us in the leadership of the conference didn't know it was coming, and we could see straight away it was a disaster. Afterwards, I was standing in the corridor. Half a dozen of the Latin American leaders came out, whom I knew. They went straight for me. How on earth did you allow that video to be showed this evening? I said, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't know anything about it. Then I saw Samuel Escobar, who was like an uncle. And I went up to him and I said, Sammy, we made a terrible mistake tonight. We showed a video which didn't reflect positively on Latin American leaders. What do you think we should do? He said to me, just go on the stage in the morning. You apologize. Even if you didn't know, don't tell them. Just apologize. Then he said, leave it to me, and I'll sort all the Latin Americans out behind the scenes. That's the role of the uncle or the auntie. He had their respect. He knew that we all make mistakes. That's why you need those folks to be around and to be involved. 7 of the best things I've learned. 1, be an encourager, be a Barnabas. There's not enough of those folks. 2, be task-orientated rather than obsessed with fulfilling your own gifts. 3, be a visionary. We touched on that. 4thly, be a reader. We touched on that. 5thly, look after yourself. One of my favorite texts is 1 Timothy 4:12. Look after yourself and your doctrine. So you need to be doctrinally sound, but we're human beings, and you need to care for yourself with appropriate rest or breaks. We haven't really talked about that, but that's pretty pivotal. 5, be generous in the way you speak of others and giving money to others. 6, be a team person. And 7, persevere without becoming bitter. Last sentence. When my son was starting out, he said, "Any tips, Dad?" And I said, "Just one. You need to develop a bottomless capacity to handle disappointment." If you remember that, and you only do that by drawing on God's grace and understanding that God is gracious, God is sovereign, and God is good, and speaking generously of others, you will definitely, I'm not a prophet, you will definitely be hurt by some other Christian's behavior. You cannot go through life without being hurt by being misunderstood or hearing somebody has gossiped against you. And one of the key reasons why people drop out as leaders is because they feel misunderstood, not appreciated, or because they hear somebody speaks ill of them. And it's really important to understand that in a fallen world, these things happen. And sometimes we have to take the hit. We can't even defend ourselves, just as Jesus modeled to us. And in that case, you have to draw on God's grace and be prepared to repent and say sorry, but also not go back on the attack and press on, knowing it's happened to many others. Michael Green, probably the greatest university evangelist I ever worked with, was fired 3 times. And when he was 72, he was fired by one agency he was working with. The leader asked to see me to tell me why he fired him. In his office, he gave me the reasons, and he said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "I'm going straight out of your office to invite the most gifted evangelist I've ever heard to work with me until he dies in training young university evangelists. You've lost the opportunity, I'm taking it." But he was hurt as a great leader by being rejected 3 times. So it will happen to us. You need to ask if there's substance in the criticism, but also draw on God's grace, work in a team, and come back.